Tariff or
Tariffs.
This is a direct attack.
I always say tariffs is the most beautiful word to me in the dictionary.
Donald Trump, who changes his mind between, breakfast 11's his lunch and supper time.
When tariffs were first announced, they came with bold promises. Former President Donald Trump argued they would make America stronger, rebuild factories, and bring jobs back home. The message was simple: protect U.S. industries, and American workers would thrive again. But the reality has turned out to be far more complicated. By 2025, the impact of these tariffs on the auto industry was undeniable. Instead of a revival, they triggered a wave of disruption that swept through companies, workers, and consumers. More than 38,000 American auto workers lost their jobs in a single year. Production lines across the Midwest went silent, and towns that had relied on steady paychecks from auto plants found themselves facing an uncertain future. Behind every statistic was a family suddenly struggling with rent, medical bills, and the fear of what comes next. Consumers were hit just as hard. The cost of buying a new car surged by $5,000 to $10,000 compared to the year before. Even models produced in the U.S. weren't spared, with average prices rising by an additional $3,000. Families that once viewed a new car as a reachable milestone of middle-class life now faced sticker shock. Many had no choice but to turn to the used car market, where demand skyrocketed. Suddenly, decade-old cars were selling for thousands above their normal value, and reliable used vehicles became as difficult to afford as new ones. As Americans struggled, Canada began to seize opportunities. Automakers redirected billions in investments to Canadian plants, shifting production and jobs north of the border. The same companies that once viewed the United States as their most profitable market now saw Canada as a safer and more stable option. For Detroit, long celebrated as the global motor capital, the consequences were devastating. Empty factories and declining job prospects made it clear that the center of gravity in North America's auto industry was beginning to shift. Toyota was one of the hardest-hit companies. For decades, it dominated American highways, earning a reputation for reliability and value. But in 2025, Toyota's U.S. operations faced a financial shock of nearly $19 billion in projected losses in a single year. Years of steady growth were wiped away almost overnight. The company's ambitious electric vehicle expansion, once central to its North American strategy, was throttled by tariffs, snarled supply chains, and rising costs. On the ground, the effects were immediate. Customers facing sticker shock walked away from showrooms, and Toyota's loyal consumer base quietly began to shrink. The company started shifting its focus toward Canada and Europe, where supply lines were steadier and trade policies less volatile. For a brand that once symbolized dominance in the U.S. market, the retreat was a stark reminder of how quickly conditions can change. Nissan's story reveals just how deep the wounds can go. For years, executives saw North America as the company's golden market, a place of growth and stability. But by 2025, Nissan recorded losses of more than $5 billion in a single year, the largest in its history. Production of staple models such as the Pathfinder and Frontier for the Canadian market was halted altogether. Even Mexico, once a critical hub for Nissan's exports to the U.S., was no longer reliable. More than 300,000 vehicles each year were caught behind tariff walls. Decades of investment began to unravel, and the company's North American operations looked increasingly unsustainable. Nissan's retreat became a powerful symbol of a company forced to pull back, not because it wanted to, but because conditions made staying impossible. Hyundai faced its own crisis, one that went beyond tariffs alone. In 2025, the company posted a $66 million loss in just the second quarter, with operating profits plunging 16%. That reversal was brutal for a brand that had been one of the fastest-growing challengers in the U.S. market. But the financial blow was only half the story. At Hyundai's Georgia plant, immigration raids led to the arrest of nearly 500 Korean workers, many of them essential to the company's electric vehicle program. Overnight, flagship projects were disrupted, and the promise of creating more than 8,000 American jobs collapsed. Local communities in Georgia, once dependent on the plant's payroll, were left reeling. Families faced sudden separations, incomes vanished, and the sense of stability evaporated. In South Korea, outrage spilled into politics, and the president was forced to intervene. What began as a labor issue had escalated into a diplomatic crisis, showing how quickly industrial challenges can spiral into international disputes. Subaru's dependence on the American market left it especially vulnerable. More than 70% of Subaru's global sales came from the U.S., a reliance unmatched by other automakers. For years, that focus had been a strength, fueling steady growth. But when tariffs struck, the foundation cracked. The company faced projected losses of $2.5 billion in a single fiscal year. The impact on customers was just as painful. Subaru had long been a favorite among middle-class families seeking practical, affordable cars. Suddenly, those cars were priced beyond reach. Buyers who once turned to Subaru as the sensible choice were forced either to hold on to aging vehicles or look elsewhere. Unlike larger rivals, Subaru had little room to pivot toward Europe or Southeast Asia. Its fate was tightly bound to the U.S. market, leaving it trapped between shrinking demand and soaring costs. Mazda, often seen as a smaller, niche player, found itself caught in the same storm. Exports from Mexico to the U.S. collapsed by more than 50% in just 4 months, leaving plants idle and workers uncertain. Production for Canada was halted as the company desperately tried to preserve what remained of its U.S. sales. At the same time, Chinese electric vehicles began flooding international markets at lower prices, putting additional pressure on Mazda's already thin margins. For a company with a loyal but limited customer base, the combined challenges threatened its very survival. Beyond corporate losses, the story of tariffs is most powerfully told through their impact on ordinary people. In 2025, buying a car, once seen as a routine part of American life, became a financial hurdle. Families stretched their budgets to cover higher monthly payments, while others simply gave up on new cars altogether. The surge in used car demand left many low- and middle-income households squeezed, with no affordable options left. Factory towns, long built on the strength of auto wages, began to crumble. Restaurants lost their regulars. Schools faced declining enrollments as families moved away in search of work. Small businesses, once kept alive by steady paychecks from auto plants, closed their doors. Communities that had once thrived on the promise of industry were left hollowed out, living with the opposite of what tariffs were meant to achieve. Meanwhile, Canada's gains have highlighted America's losses. New plants and investments are being directed north, creating thousands of jobs in Canadian cities while U.S. towns are left behind. Ottawa has become the new magnet for capital and contracts once destined for Detroit. The transformation has recast the U.S. not as a safe haven for investment, but as a market seen as unstable and unpredictable. The world is taking notice. For decades, the United States was considered the most profitable and secure market for global automakers. Today, that reputation is under question. If foreign manufacturers no longer view America as reliable, what does that mean for other sectors that depend on international trust and investment, from technology to energy to agriculture? This moment is about more than cars. It is about the direction of the U.S. economy and its role in the world. Tariffs promise to protect workers and revive industry, but so far they have left families paying higher prices, workers losing jobs, and entire communities grappling with decline. The car, once a proud symbol of American independence and middle-class life, is now slipping out of reach for many, and the cost of that shift is enormous. If this video gave you something to think about, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps us share more stories that matter. And let us know in the comments, do you believe tariffs can ever deliver on their promises, or do they ultimately harm the very people they are meant to protect? The story of tariffs on automakers doesn't end with corporate retreats and rising car prices. The second wave of consequences is only beginning to unfold, and it reaches far beyond factory floors. One of the most significant ripple effects is on supply chains. For decades, auto manufacturing depended on a finely tuned system where parts crossed borders multiple times before a finished vehicle rolled off the line. Tariffs shattered that rhythm. Engines assembled in Mexico, electronics shipped from Japan, and steel sourced globally now face layers of new costs. The result is delays, shortages, and uncertainty at every step of production. For workers, this means unpredictable schedules, sudden layoffs, and constant fear that the next slowdown will be permanent. Dealerships, too, are caught in the storm. Once bustling showrooms now sit quieter as consumers shy away from inflated prices. Sales staff who once thrived on steady commissions are struggling to make ends meet. Independent dealerships, often family-owned for generations, are closing their doors, leaving behind empty lots that symbolize yet another casualty of disrupted trade. Even insurance and financing sectors are feeling the squeeze. With cars more expensive, lenders face higher risks as families stretch beyond their budgets. Insurance companies are recalculating rates as replacement costs climb, forcing drivers to pay more not only for their cars, but also to keep them on the road. What began as a trade policy has now become a financial burden, touching nearly every household. Internationally, the strain is shifting alliances. Canada's rise as a production hub is strengthening its ties with Japan and South Korea, while the U.S. is seen as increasingly unpredictable. This rebalancing may not reverse anytime soon. Once companies invest billions into Canadian plants, those jobs and supply chains are unlikely to return south, even if policies change. For America, that means a permanent loss of influence in an industry it once dominated. The lesson is becoming clearer. Tariffs may appear simple on paper, a tax meant to protect domestic jobs, but in practice, they set off a chain reaction that reshapes industries, disrupts lives, and alters the global balance of power. And as automakers, workers, and families know all too well, the real cost is paid not in boardrooms, but in everyday homes and communities.